Very much for coming in. I'll have the other judges introduce themselves, but let me start by telling you how this session works. In this part of the competition, you're taking on a fictional business identity and assigning a fictional business identity to the judges. So make sure you let us know what that is. Please make sure everyone knows who you are and who they are before you begin. You'll have 25 minutes with a 5-minute cushion to describe the legal, financial, and ethical dimensions of the problem and to recommend a solution that passes muster on all 3 counts. During this time, teams will be uninterrupted. When you're finished, the judges will ask questions for 20 minutes. During the Q&A, both you and the judges stay in character. After the Q&A, the judges will give you feedback outside the role play. Some important things to keep in mind. The ethical aspects of your analysis are the most important part. However, these should be described in simple, practical, common sense fashion. Using technical, philosophical terminology or basing your argument on religious or theological grounds will be considered a serious weakness. Similarly, any member of the team reading his or her part will also be considered a major mistake, although you may use notes. During this presentation, every member of the team must have some sort of speaking role. Okay, with that, my name is Stan Botts. I'm a retired ethics officer from Verizon. I've been a commissioner of occupational professional licensing for the state of Maryland and commissioner for the Water and Sewer Authority. And these are our other judges.
Good morning, ladies. I'm Thomas Dowd. I'm recently retired as a middle school teacher. This is my star pupil from a few years ago.
We're going to have to get him to recuse himself.
And prior to that, I worked for the Hospital Corporation of America, where I was the Vice President of Sales for 25 years.
Great. Good morning, ladies. My name is Sherry Gittleman. I work at New Balance, and I'm on our supply chain compliance program. So I work on human rights, environmental issues in our global supply chain. And prior to that, I spent 13 years in the mining industry. We'll talk about that at the closing session, but don't worry about that right now, or that this is your former teacher. Okay.
We got a lot of conversation. I can tell you mine is going to be the only unbiased one. For sure. All righty, well, when you're ready, let me know, and I will have a timer going. Do you have a timer right there as well?
I do.
And I will try to not get so caught up that I don't give you a 5-minute warning to let you know that it's about to expire, but if I get caught up, that means you're doing a really good job. All right. So when you're ready, you can start.
So, to start out with today, thank you for coming to our presentation. My name is Sarah McCool, and these are my colleagues.
Hi, my name is Simia Song.
Hi, my name is Jason Kaya.
And we're here from Hayami Consulting Group to talk to you about Apple, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the rare earth mineral cobalt. So, the Sky and Dune investigation has found children as young as 4 years old mining cobalt in mines in the DRC. Dorson, a child around 8 years old, and Richard, who is 11, have both talked about how Dorson doesn't earn enough in one day to get more than one meal every 2 days. And Richard talks about how his body aches from how difficult the work is in these Congolese mines. Cobalt is an essential component of lithium-ion batteries, which power smartphones from your iPhones, your Apple Watch, to your iPod, to your iPad. They're the thing that makes the device work. They are more efficient, and they are essential for producing Apple's products. They are basically the backbone of Apple's business model. So how many people in here have a smartphone? I know that we kind of have more than one, you have one, you have one. So it's pretty ubiquitous to have this kind of device in your pocket, but the labor that's behind the making of these devices looks more like this than people sitting in an office in Cupertino that you might have thought, because very little regulation of the cobalt mining industry, especially in the DRC in particular, has meant that the chances that the cobalt in your phone have come from a child mining it in the DRC are fairly high. And even if we take that chance and think, oh, well, maybe that other 60% is what's inside my phone, because of the structure of the DRC and the situation there, it's nearly impossible for us to tell whether or not your cobalt was mined by child labor or mined by a mining company. And so if you'll take a look behind me, you can see that global iPhone sales are only increasing. So we're looking at the demands for cobalt as just skyrocketing. It's continuing in an upward trend without any signal that it's going to decrease. which means that people are running to the DRC to try to secure their supply because with the advent of self-driving cars, like the one you see LeBron James in here, the demand for cobalt in even greater quantities is extreme, with companies like Toyota, Tesla, and Uber all trying to get a cornerstone of this market so that they can be able to power their innovations and their technologies. Unscrupulous practices in the DRC are incredibly tempting and incredibly common. So with that, we're going to talk about the bigger demand for the mineral itself, which is projected here to be around 350,000 tons by 2030. So we're looking at kind of right now, large production, but just astronomical production by the year 2030. So we're here today to discuss the ethical, legal, and financial implications of Apple's practices sourcing cobalt in the DRC. And so with that, I'm going to pass things off to Simi, who's going to give you a little bit of background in the region.
Hi everyone, my name is Simi, and I'm going to give you a background on the Congo and the history of mining and the political situation in this Central African nation. So cobalt has been mined for millennia and has been used for a variety of purposes, in the beginning as a blue pigment and now for green vehicles that are electric. And today, cobalt is critical in the production of lithium-ion batteries that are used in a wealth of products, including Apple's iPhones, iPods, and iPads. And 2/3 of the world's entire supply of cobalt is found in the Congo. And the other 1/3 is scattered around 15 different countries in the world, including Russia, Zambia, Australia, and Canada. What's important to note here is that not all of these countries are more secure sources than the DRC, but they are on the back end of production, and they have much less cobalt in reserves than the DRC currently does. In other words, the DRC is expected to increase its share of the world's cobalt as more of the product is mined. We can see here that Russia is rated second, but Australia has 1.2 million tons in reserves, and that's 2.3 million tons less than what the DR has. So there's no other country that comes close to having the amount of cobalt that the DRC has in reserves. But despite a wealth of fertile soil, hydroelectric power potential, and in mineral resources, the DRC's economy continues to perform extremely poorly. And this is primarily because the DRC is politically unstable. Now this is an image of the Fragile States Index, which is a quantifier that analyzes the strength and the sustainability of state power. It uses a couple of different indicators to calculate this, including like factionalized elites, internally displaced persons, human rights, rule of law, security, and a couple of other characteristics. A high score on the index indicates less stability. Currently, the DRC rates 7 out of 178 countries on this index. If you look at the map, right smack dab in the middle of Africa, you can see a dark red country, which is the DRC. And this is comparable to Sudan, Somalia, and Syria, which are some of the most violent places on the earth today. So we can see that the DRC is really in a very unstable position at this point in time. In fact, since the beginning of this year, there has been a rise in armed conflicts, which have continued to plague the country, especially in the eastern region, where many of the mines are located. There were elections that were scheduled for 2017, which have been postponed to the end of 2018, as political instability and clashes between soldiers and militia continue to escalate. In this image, we see some members of Congolese opposition parties burning cars and just generally causing, a ruckus because they're trying to get the current sitting president out and he doesn't want to go out. So this is really causing lots of problems between the opposition parties, the militia, and any other, multinationals, countries who have an interest in the DRC. There's just a huge melting pot of interest competing against each other for this one very important mineral that's useful to all of us today. So the crisis in the DRC has deteriorated exponentially over the last 2 years, with normal, typically stable regions morphing into hotbeds of unrest. There's intercommunal violence that has displaced an estimated 4.5 million people. Right now, there's currently the hugest outcry for funding for the DRC in recent years in terms of humanitarian aid and help. And many people have been driven from their homes into neighboring countries or other parts of the DRC and have died from malnutrition and lack of access to humanitarian aid. So an estimated 120 armed groups are currently operating in eastern DR Congo alone. These local militias, backed by mining multinationals, get supplies of food, money, and military hardware from different countries in exchange for smuggled resource riches. So what they do is that they go into the mines illegally and they use child labor, which is basically slave labor, using women, children, and people who are ill to get this resource illegally and then sell it to people for this money in the black market. So the mining and trafficking of these minerals is a booming industry which continues to thrive off these bullets, because nothing serves this illicit trade better than a state that doesn't have, that really doesn't have much of a government to speak of, and does not collect taxes and really has no infrastructure to be able to support such a rich industry. And there are very few international standards or regulations for the extraction of cobalt, and attempts to enforce standards have been consumed by chronic corruption and the huge illicit market for this metal. The flourishing black market, which a number of reports allege to be controlled by China, trades in cobalt extracted informally by organized criminal groups under appalling conditions. So in this image, we see children washing copper by hand. I know we've been talking about cobalt, but cobalt is often a byproduct of copper. So these two metals tend to be interrelated in terms of the mining locations and the products that are gotten from them. So the biggest concern has been the growing number of reports of the use of children in the mining of cobalt. Children like Dawson and Richard that we mentioned earlier are known as cruisers, which is French for diggers. And they're also called artisanal miners, which of course is a very nice way of saying people who enter mines that are hand dug and dig with no protective equipment whatsoever. They enter these unofficial, unregulated, and unmonitored mines where men, women, and children basically work in slave conditions. These mine tunnels, I hope you can see this image properly. This is a man descending into the tunnel in the DRC with only a headlamp on his head to protect him. And there's no scaffolding, nothing around the mine to support him. He's literally going straight down into the earth and going to find whatever he finds there. So these mine tunnels are dug by miners who have no protective equipment. These tunnels have no support and are prone to collapse, especially in the rainy season, which is actually most of the year in Congo. So many times, they have lists of miners who go into the mine every day, and each day they cross out names as people are lost to this work that they go into. So not only are human rights being violated in these mines, but there's a ton of ecological destruction happening because of the lack of safety precautions and proper mining practices, which ensure the pollution of the waters and soils of the Congo. So we see here another copper mine, and we can see how completely destroyed this area has been. So the byproducts from this mining often leach into the waters and the soils. So even if you don't necessarily live close to a mine, you definitely are going to feel the effects downstream because your water sources are polluted, the soil is polluted, the crops and the animals that you're trying to eat are all polluted by the effects of illegal and unsustainable mining practices. Children are also being born with extremely rare birth defects that aren't found anywhere else in the world as a result of the effects of mining practices that we see pictured here. And also there's a rising rate of respiratory disease, which is caused by the amount of cobalt and copper that's just in the air. So Chinese mining companies are often the middlemen in cobalt's journey from DRC to your smartphone. And these middlemen sell cobalt mostly to an exporter, which is one of the largest, called the Congo Dongfang International Company, which is a subsidiary of Zhejiang Huayu Cobalt, who then takes this cobalt that has been acquired informally to battery makers, who then sell these lithium-ion batteries that contain cobalt, which has been gotten from these mines, to companies like Apple, like Tesla, like Samsung, and like Microsoft. So the supply line, as I've shown you, is extremely chaotic, informal, and unregulated, with unofficial, non-standardized prices paid out to groups, individuals, and larger networks. So you can see right here, the guy is calculating on his phone, trying to figure out how much he pay these cruisers, like I mentioned earlier, the artisanal miners, the diggers. And he decides what to pay them. And they don't ask any questions about where this cobalt comes from or who has worked to extract it. They're just concerned with getting the best and, of course, the cheapest price. In 2016, Amnesty International found that no country legally requires firms to publicly report their cobalt supply chains, allowing multinationals easy deniability. Of course, when you just source your batteries from companies that have been supplied by the cobalt mining companies, it's very easy to say we actually don't have any knowledge of what is happening in the supply chains, because that could be the the prerogative of the mining companies who actually are right at the source getting this mineral. So now I'm going to hand it over to Tracy, who's going to talk about Apple's role in this in the DRC.
So as the board of directors of Apple, you're all well familiar with these products. The iPhone, the Mac, iPad, Apple Watch. What's interesting is that all these devices require cobalt for production. So Simi has just walked us through the atrocious activities that are happening in Congo due to the mining of cobalt. And you wonder, how does this tie into you? If you look at this chart, we have 65.3% revenue coming from just iPhones alone. Meaning, anything that disrupts the production of iPhones will disrupt your revenue and will be very impactful. If you can look at the rest, we still have the iPad, which is 10.9%, which is also a device that has cobalt in it. In addition to it, we have the Mac, which is 16.2%, also has cobalt in it. From the other services and other products, we still have the Apple Watch, which still uses lithium-ion batteries that require cobalt. And so, as we talk about these problems, I'm sure the first thing that's coming to your mind is, what will be the financial cost of this to you? As I mentioned, it will be a tough decision, because there will be a very huge financial cost. But what is the main problem? The problem is not that Apple is sourcing cobalt from Congo. The problem is that these mining companies that are sourcing the cobalt from Congo have supply chains that they cannot attest to say that children are not working in these mines. As you can see here, we have Apple buying its lithium-ion batteries from Samsung, who then has a chain to LNF, which has two chains that lead to either small-scale mining by hand or industrial mines. So it's hard for you to figure out, within our supply chain, do we really have a clean supply chain? And the problem is this is the abhorrent conditions in which my colleague has talked about, in which this mining is done. And we cannot continue like this. We cannot allow these small children to be affected, their lives to be affected by in an attempt to find cobalt for Apple. So why do you use lithium-ion batteries? Well, lithium-ion batteries have their advantages. One, they have a high energy density. What does that mean? That means that when you charge your phone in the morning, you can go through the whole day with it without having to plug it in. They have a low rate of discharge. As you have your phone on the table, it's losing energy. However, with lithium-ion batteries, the amount of energy that's lost is less compared to other alternatives. The lithium-ion battery is actually pretty low maintenance. So once you buy your iPhone, you don't have to keep coming back to the store in regards to batteries for at least 2 years. So first off, we'd like to commend you for hiring us and identifying the problem. This is the first step in attempting to fix this problem in Congo. Second of all, we'd also like to commend you on the Responsible Cobalt Initiative that you took with Samsung in 2016 and a cobalt company in an attempt to clean the supply chains. However, in 2018 today, it's unfortunate that even with this initiative, not much has been done. There's still a lot more that needs to be done on our part. From this, you can see that from what Sarah talked about, what Simi talked about, it is a clear ethical problem because these children in Congo, not only are they missing out on their education, they're also missing out on the chance to develop their future. They're here working in cobalt mines, developing a product for us, a product that they may never even use in their whole lifetime. Is that fair to them? I don't think so. We'll have my colleague Sarah walk us through the legal implications of this to Apple.
So we've talked a lot about the background in the Congo and about ethical issues that are surrounding cobalt and operation in the region, and I'm going to talk a little bit about everyone's favorite topic, which are legal implications and legal liabilities. So to start out with, I'd like to say that the United Nations has a number of guidelines and statutes for multinational corporations that act from various countries, especially countries like Congo where state power is very weak and the apparatus for sort of legal distribution is really unregulated. And among that is one of their recommendations is to try to mitigate human rights disasters, to end child labor, and to end the worst type of child work, which is work that is backbreaking, damaging, could potentially lead to human trafficking. So the situation in Congo actually does fall into all of those categories. So the biggest legal implication we want to talk about is the idea that Apple as a massive country, or as a massive corporation, is not matching up to what the United Nations recommends that multinational corporations do in these regions. But the second thing that I'd like to sort of point out is that the international law, legal sector, is constantly emerging and changing. Because we haven't really had a situation before where multinational companies have been regulated, because we hear a lot about globalization today, but globalization is very new. So the idea that it's something that might need to be wrangled with, might need to be regulated, is emerging right now in really sort of unpredictable ways. And Apple is almost like a nation unto itself. I mean, on any given day, the probability that Apple has more cash and liquidated securities than the United States Treasury is really high. It's really been a trade-off of how much cash is actually in the bank at any one time. And so with this type of international profile, we see a lot of regulation, but a lot of also interactions with Apple that look like they're state interactions, but that are unregulated. And so this is fairly problematic. If we think about controversies surrounding Apple, Apple is currently the source of controversy in the EU for their corporate tax practices in Ireland, which have led the European Union to take a look at Apple's sort of tax sheltering policies, which, while completely legal, are against the mission statement of the EU. And so whatever legal decision comes, as we've seen from Tim Cook's response, is not going to be in Apple's favor, and it's going to be more heavily regulated than if Apple had been seen to be a good faith actor with the European Union and with the European market. The same can be said of China, where Apple is also the source of controversy for conditions in the factories that make iPhones, where some workers have tried to take their own lives because the work is so stressful and monotonous that they can't see any better existence for themselves. And also, the pay is so low. So I've talked about treaties and Apple as a nation, but the concrete legal consequences are really in the unpredictability of what's going to happen next. It's a liability in that nobody knows what's going to happen. And you see the image behind me is the International Court of Justice in The Hague, which when we think of the ICJ, we think of Slovakian war crimes. But the fact of the matter is the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court do have the jurisdiction to indict multinational companies. They just haven't done so yet because Congo is very underreported and because these issues have historically been seen as something that states can control. And part of the reason that is because it's much more profitable to say, well, that's for the Congolese government to figure out, that's not for me. But as we've seen today, the ethical implications and the ethical responsibilities for Apple to help at least not exacerbate human rights violations and ideally to improve them to help the human development of Congo are what's really paramount here. And we can take for a concrete example the Islamic Republic of Iran and the British and French oil companies that were operating there until all of those companies were nationalized by Iran, because the unscrupulous practices of those oil companies had led them to structure agreements that basically meant that they had purchased the land from under the Iranian people. They said, okay, you can be Iran, but we own this land, we own this oil, and you can have none of it. So when the nationalist regime changed, those companies were completely blocked out of the market. There was no more source to Iranian oil. And Iran is not the world's best or only source of oil, but Congo is the world's best, most viable source of cobalt. And given all of the unrest in Congo, the probability of a nationalist regime change that will block out all foreign neo-colonialist operations in the country are very high. And so now that we've looked at these sort of legal and international issues, we're going to move on to solutions and financial implications, because we believe that neither of those things can be separated from the other.
Thanks, Sarah. So now I'm going to give an overview of our recommendations to Apple today. Firstly, we suggest that Apple and its business partners embrace all United Nations statutes and resolutions on fair labor practices, global business, and child labor, in order to ensure that they're operating ethically everywhere that they work and not simply in the Congo. Secondly, We suggest that Apple draws strict terms of engagement with mining companies and all other suppliers. Mining companies must prove that their supply chains are devoid of human rights violations before doing business with Apple and its contemporaries. Coalitions like the Responsible Cobalt Initiative are important to create these standards for the industry and eliminate human rights abuses in the cobalt supply chain. When companies come together, it's often easier to get suppliers to do the right thing. And there are many companies such as Verite, a non-profit, which actually go into supply chains and do that research and assessment in factories and on the ground, basically, to find out whether the child labor practices are actually happening. Next, we offer Apple the opportunity to invest even more than they already have in research and development initiatives. Apple needs to pump more money and resources into developing and improving alternative power sources for their products, which do not require conflict minerals such as cobalt. This has two benefits. It helps the humanitarian crisis in the Congo, but also helps to restore Apple to its position as an industry leader, not just in technological innovation, but in terms of social innovation, and not just reacting to the conversation, but being a leader. We also encourage Apple to partner with recently re-established Canadian mining companies that view the labor market of the DRC as a resource to trade and empower. It's important for Apple to train its labor force because this helps create a strong, stable relationship in their cobalt supply and mining relations. Creating jobs also helps them curry favor with the Congolese government and its people. Now I'm going to hand over to Tracy, who's going to talk a bit more about these recommendations. Thank you, Simi.
So in addition to the recommendations that my colleague has pointed out, Apple needs to lean into other sources of cobalt, such as Australia. As we can see from this graph, and Simi pointed out initially, Australia is the next country that has reserves as high as the DRC. So if Apple can look into tapping into these reserves instead of doing it in the Congo, they would be moving towards trying to mitigate this problem. While we are aware that this will be a huge financial cost to Apple, in terms of the rise in price of cobalt, you should know that you will not be alone in this. Because if the price in cobalt goes up, it goes up for everyone. And as Apple, you will stand out as industry leaders if you come out as the first people to try and solve this problem that has been here for years on end. And so we call on you to try and do something, try and stop this problem in Congo, because as we have seen, it is a horrible problem that requires solutions, not tomorrow, not next year, but today. And so we'll have Sarah conclude for us.
So just to close out, we have Apple, a massive multinational corporation. We have cobalt, a rare earth mineral found in Congo, and we have the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is alternately referred to as the most war-torn place on earth, the sexual assault capital of the world, and a number of other modifiers that describe just how unstable that region is. And so we've shown you the ethical, legal, and financial implications of operating there. We've also given you several viable solutions that we think would really help improve Apple's relationship to the DRC and to cobalt. And we also want to note that the financial cost of all of these things are for the short term. So a short-term bump in supply is always, and in supply chain management is always a little risky. But the fact of the matter is that Congo is so unstable and so poised to become the market monopoly on cobalt that creating a more stable and sustainable relationship now will make Apple a more viable and profitable country or corporation in the long term and for generations to come. And so by taking these steps that other corporations aren't taking, what we're really doing is urging Apple to place itself in the most beneficial position for long-term innovation and not just short-term results. So thank you for listening to our presentation today, and I think we're going to take some questions.
Thank you. Okay, I would let one of my other judges take the lead. I'm so used to jumping out front, and I think there's more experience here, so.
Yeah, I have a number of questions for you guys.
Do you want us to come over here?
That would be great, yeah. Let's take up the space. So one of my questions, I think, Cindy, you had mentioned the Responsible Cobalt Initiative.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about it and why you said it hasn't achieved much to date, or why you're not recommending that Apple encourage, continue to work on initiatives such as that?
Oh no, we are recommending that Apple continues to push that for more action from the Responsible Cobalt Initiative. So while we were doing our research, we found a lot of information about the creation of this initiative, but not a lot of information about what they've actually done, right? They found a couple of press releases, a couple of websites that had information about the Cobalt Initiative, but nothing saying the actual steps that have been taken, which is why we're recommending steps that the Cobalt Initiative could take to mitigate the situation in the DR right now.
I guess my fundamental concern about leaving Congo and going to Australia is competition.
Yeah.
So right now the iPhone is competing a lot with Samsung, right, and Galaxy phones. And if Apple leaves the Congo, will it actually change anything in Congo? Because I think you're saying what we need to do is really try and help the people and the children in Congo.
Yeah.
So how does leaving Congo solve the problem if our competition remains?
So that's supposed to be a very temporary solution. I mean, Congo is definitely the most viable place to obtain cobalt, and it's going to be the most viable place, for the foreseeable future. So we're recommending that we look into other places, other sources, while we're trying to fix the infrastructural problems here or contribute what we can to improving the infrastructural issues here. So that was not supposed to be like, abandon the Congo completely and then move into Australia because the Congo is unstable. We're recommending that because we know that this process is not going to be short or easy one, and in the meantime, it might cause some problems in terms of sourcing while trying to, restructure that system. And so we're recommending that Apple will look into other sources in places like Australia where you might not have before, in order to bolster your supply, while making those changes in your primary source.
And just one clarifying question, and I'll pass it on. When you talked about engaging and working with Canadian mining companies, did you mean Canadian mining companies in Congo?
We did.
That wasn't
Yeah,
clear.
we did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do the Canadian mining companies have the same issues with how that product gets to these Canadian mining companies? Nobody seems to know.
So if you recall from the supply chain graph that we showed you, in the very beginning, it was like small scale artisanal miners and then also industry mines. So there are a couple of industry mines that do have some of these infrastructure, this sustainable infrastructure present, but they aren't as profitable, I guess, as the artisanal mining is, because of course that's like a much quicker supply chain. It's just from the ground to the Chinese companies and then on to the battery makers. So the Canadian mining companies fit into that industrial mining complex, and we recommend that Apple look into partnering with them, considering that they definitely have those sustainable infrastructures in terms of lack of human rights violations in the supply chains.
Well, Apple certainly isn't in the mining business per se. They use the product. I'm wondering where historically we've had a problem with natural resources, child labor, unstable governments, maybe something like the blood diamonds.
Right.
Are you aware of any other situation where you've got a condition like this, where you're asking a Western country to come into somewhere like Africa and be the fix? Is this model out there somewhere? Do we have to reinvent the wheel, or is there something we could learn from?
There is definitely, there are a number of things that we can learn from. And so part of as you said, Apple is not in the mining industry, but what Apple is doing right now is, as you mentioned earlier, competition is trying to get into the mining industry to kind of shore up that supply. And our biggest concern is that the mining industry is as it stands, is exacerbating these conditions. And so there are a number of things we can look to, and I think the most productive for our situation is the fair trade sort of label that goes on what's right now a very food product idea, but also conflict-free. As we saw blood diamonds, the process became a certification process, it became an oversight process. It wasn't just Apple alone, but Apple has this power to sort of spur this issue forward and to bring in NGOs and to bring in United Nations funding, to work with the United Nations Development Program, to really bring attention to an area that really hasn't had a lot of attention, in a way that makes things certified conflict-free, makes them fair trade, makes them ethical products, as opposed to sort of consuming the product of this conflict.
And we're really relying on the fact that Apple is already known for being innovative leaders, for being market leaders, for their brand of pushing innovation forward all the time. We're relying on that, and we think that by bringing up this topic and by exposing it and by creating kind of furor around it in like gathering people to fix it, that will cement their place as leaders, not only in technological innovation but in social innovation. So it's not a problem that only Apple, is going to handle by itself. But we think that by taking that first step, it's going to create a wave of positive change.
It's also important to note that the scale at which Apple operates is very large, and Apple has the resources and capital to be able to make a difference. That's why we're pushing for solutions that are on the ground and also off the ground.
Did you look into any possibility of us working with some of the other large users of cobalt to help to try to change this whole supply chain problem? And I guess where I'm going is, if we could possibly sway some of the other large users, Tesla, Samsung, whoever, to maybe partner with us to use more of the cobalt that comes out of Australia, that we could possibly be infusing them with more capital to generate what is a larger supply. Do you have any information on working with some of the other users of this product?
Like a consortium?
Yes.
Yeah. So currently, the Responsible Cobalt Initiative that we mentioned earlier, the companies that are currently members are Apple, Samsung, and I think Microsoft, and also with cobalt mining companies. So like the Zhejiang Cryo Cobalt company that I mentioned earlier, the Chinese mining company, which is basically the largest cobalt mining company coming out of the DRC, that supplies all the cobalt to the battery makers, that supplies companies like Samsung and Apple and Tesla and Microsoft. So these are the types of solutions that we're pushing for the responsible business, for the Responsible Cobalt Initiative to, innovate. These are the kinds of conversations that we would like, these hard conversations that we would like the Responsible Cobalt Initiative to begin. So of course, Apple has taken, you guys have taken this first step of creating this initiative, and now it's just to push it forward and really put our backs into it and kind of get it on the ground and rolling.
Do you think there's a risk? I know you mentioned China, but China has been, working very closely with Africa, investing a lot of money in infrastructure development in Africa, right? And not making any requests to the government about human rights and labor conditions and whatnot. What is the danger to the United States and to our brands by pulling out of Congo and pretty much just letting the Chinese dominate the entire cobalt market? And is that something you guys considered as a risk?
So I can take that one. No. The short answer is no. Because the fact is that the reality that you're describing is already the reality. In that China does have this immense relationship, not just with DR Congo, but with Africa. And I mean, China has this relationship with countries all over the world. Chinese investment is kind of breathtaking in its depth and in its scale, of even properties in Boston being purchased by Chinese companies. So the reason we're leaning more into reform instead of a rejection of Congo is because we believe that American and multinational companies like Apple are in a better place to use our economic structure and our brand ethics, which is really important in this particular case, to push for better changes and to also bring more scrutiny on what the Chinese are doing. Because this that in China it's called the special relationship, but the special relationship between the DRC and China is really just China taking resources from the DRC at what is nowhere near a fair price. So we actually think that Apple's actions in this circumstance are going to bring more beneficial attention, more beneficial aid, and possibly even, hopefully, regulation to Congo that China would never have pushed for. And we're hoping this kind of attention sort of plays their hand, pushes them to sort of have to accept what will become a market standard as opposed to a market outlier.
And fun fact, one of the mines that we actually showed, the 10K copper mine, was recently, China actually made a huge investment recently of $2.6 billion to the Congolese government to kind of wrest control of these resources. And that's kind of like really where the resource is. Like that's like kind of the hotbed of, that's where the reserves really are in the eastern part of Congo. So they're really, moving in and trying to wrest control, which is why we think that it's important for Apple to take action now.
I'm hearing what I think are two different things being compared. I'm hearing what is the Chinese investment in changing things and doing, having an impact on the supply chain. and I'm hearing what is the concern of Apple. I'm a little concerned when I hear our corporation being compared to a country. You know, and so have you looked at the impact or the avenues that may exist for us as Apple to do something to encourage or involve the United States as opposed to us trying to push this? Because us Apple pushing against China is like one of those kids trying to move a mountain. But
Yeah, I think your point is extraordinarily valid, and I think that's absolutely true. And the biggest thing is that Apple, I mean, I don't know, I was very young when the first iPhone was released, but Apple in the United States has this immense like cultural impact and social impact. And so part of what we're encouraging today is sort of just by advocating on this issue, by forming initiatives, by bringing, the United States government and sort of the Red Cross, the United Nations Development Project, like all of those things into this region through a push by Apple, through a partnership, that collectively is sort of the pushback, not against China, because China doesn't acknowledge this relationship so openly as to say that it's a state policy, but the actions of Chinese corporations. And because Apple is as large as it is, I mean, it operates on 6 continents. There aren't a whole lot of corporations other than maybe McDonald's that can make that same claim to ubiquity. And so we're really suggesting here is for Apple to talk about the problem, to acknowledge the problem, to push for collaborations, and to sort of try to use the power that they have to affect other organizations that have power to try to help fix this problem.
What about just bypassing the problem in terms of technology? How viable is it to just go beyond the lithium battery, go to the next generation energy supplier? Just it's like oil, there are other forms of energy.
Right.
Why not, I wonder, is there the expertise out there now or on the near horizon that would allow companies to do that? Just bypass it.
So there are the alternatives to the lithium-ion battery. However, there's a huge cost impact on that because they're more expensive. Second of all, the weight. So lithium-ion, the lithium-ion batteries are they're very light. And for portable devices such as your iPhone, that's what makes them ideal. So while there's still research and development into these other sources, that's why we're asking Apple to push more money and resources into coming up with alternative sources that are viable for them as a company operating, attempting to make a profit, and also for the user, so that we don't have to end up with iPhones that are, 10 pounds.
And that's interesting to me because I just written a note here on the R&D. Early on in your slides, you mentioned investing more into the research and development. Have you got anything to show what may be the crossover point for the investment in research and development starting to outweigh the cost of the cobalt coming out of these mines? At what point is there a crossover where that research and development may offer what is a solution that's comparable to the savings that we realize now from the cobalt mines?
So it's very interesting that Apple as a company operates with very little exposure to the public light, so that these records are very hard to get. We're unable to get records that show that this is where the research and development is, and this is where that, if we pump more into research and development, this is the point at which cost and research development will outweigh each other. So we don't have that information at hand.
But we did find that the consensus of people watching the industry was that kind of technology is far away, especially and because it is far away, companies have thought let's just not even bother. But I mean, if we were always thinking, why don't we just not bother, then technology would never move forward. So,
to your knowledge, any source of information about a consortium for the research and development? Whereas not just Apple, but maybe Apple, Samsung, all of these companies look at some sort of consortium for the research and development, because I hear what you're saying, they're very close in their information, and it's a very expensive proposition. Maybe the answer could be a consortium of some sort that would help to get us there faster.
Is your issue primarily the issue of child labor and exposing these young people to hazardous conditions?
I mean, our issue is not just children, but just human rights violations. So there are human rights, child labor is obviously one of the largest of these, but we're talking about, you know, a lack of clean water, we're talking about civil war, we're talking about mass violence, we're talking about mass rape, we're talking about all of these issues tied into one sort of industry. And so we pulled out child labor today to make, you know, a little bit more of a coherent thing, because Congo's history is massive and convoluted and very sort of difficult to really distill. But that's what our issue is, really.
And Sarah, just to follow up on that, I think my question is in terms of Apple, we're not causing child labor in the DRC. We can pull out tomorrow, it will still continue because of the role of the Chinese and all the other brands. So
Right.
what is the risk to Apple? Because you've talked about legal risks, you've mentioned the UN, but I have a hard time seeing that we would actually be held responsible for what you're talking about. Is the impact really a reputational risk in our US consumer, or I just don't quite understand the legal risk to
Right.
the company.
So the legal risks to the company, and part of the reason that they're kind of controversial, I'd actually like to answer 2 points. The first is
Sure.
to your whether or not Apple pulled out tomorrow, child labor would still continue. And that's true. Part of human development has started out with child labor and moved forward. And so our concern isn't in Apple leaving Congo, it's in Apple bettering Congo and looking like these Canadian mining companies do at a labor force that can be empowered and trained and paid more so that children aren't working in mines. So we very much don't want to say, you know, this sort of white savior moment of just being pull out of here, fix all of the problems. Nobody, and Apple alone, will not fix Congo alone. But there's plenty the company can do to stop or to help, at least in their own personal little ethical responsibility box, not be exacerbating these problems. And as far as the legal liability goes, we are in large part, tangibly and predictably right now, talking about sort of a brand response, not just from American consumers, but especially from consumers in Europe, consumers in Africa, consumers in Asia, who are looking at sort of American, if you'll take my metaphor, hegemony over economy and over technology, and thinking like, look, these American people are just gonna come in and they're making the places where I live or the places where these people live worse. And I think what's hard about quantifying brand ethics is that your brand is really the emotional response that your consumer has to your product. And so what we want is for the consumer to have a good and a favorable emotional response the world over, as opposed to sort of looking at, you know, your iPhone and thinking, I love my iPhone, but is there something really rotten here? Do I actually, so the next time, maybe we were saying to each other, the next time an upgrade comes up for my iPhone, am I gonna buy an iPhone, or am I gonna sort of look into something else? And as far as legal implications go, the legal decision for the EU case has already come down not in Apple's favor. So Apple is going to lose money because their tax practices were not in line with the European Union's. The DRC is less stable, but those possibilities there still exist, especially if the situation there worsens, all of that. Getting tied up in a situation like that, really not a good legal position to be in.
I hear what you're saying about the brand and how we could possibly impact that on the American front. Do you have any statistics that show us what the numbers are for Apple products in companies that, in countries that are not as keen on the fair labor practices as we are here in America? Because what I'm thinking is that we may have a product that the branding on the other fronts is as large, if not larger, than what we have here in the U.S. And what we do to impact it could be very minimal in terms of those other countries that do not see the fair labor practices impact as we do.
So I think what's interesting there is when we're comparing other major markets, fair labor practices for us are the impetus behind, you know, maybe not purchasing this iPhone, having a detrimental financial effect. But for those other countries, especially I'm thinking about the Chinese market where Apple is struggling to break in, it's less about fair labor practices and more about national affiliation and perceived corporate practices. So in those areas, these competitions and sort of like the idea, the narrative, the neo-colonial narrative, which I know I've mentioned before, it's a hit to that market because it feeds into perceived or real what the United States market just does all of the time. Is your own cultural institution, your neighborhood restaurant was replaced by a McDonald's. Apple's trying to sell you this phone, and oh look, like they're also, where did they get this phone? They got it from children in Congo, and they don't care, and they've done nothing about it. And I mean, if you're a consumer in Beijing, China, and you have a friend who works at the Apple factory, and they are clinically depressed and can't get treatment for that issue, like that ripples in the market, even if it's not necessarily about the sort of Western ethos of fair trade economics.
I think it's also important to note that in today's age of the internet, if Apple is in the news for something like this, fine, it's the US that brought this to light. However, this news will spread the world over. So we've seen this happen to like brands like Nike. You know, when people were calling for a boycott, it wasn't just in the US, it happened internationally. So even if these other countries would not look into Apple sourcing, their consumers will be exposed to this information and they'll, you know, it will be a hit on Apple's revenue.
I know, do we have time for one more question, Steve? Sure. Okay. I know we talked about blood diamonds, but I was surprised you basically mentioned conflict minerals because it's a DRC and it was legal as well. There was regulations around it and around companies reporting. Can you just talk a little bit about conflict minerals? Is there anything learned from those minerals and that approach that you guys would recommend for cobalt?
So because of the rise in technological innovations, we got like around electric cars and even with iPhones. Cobalt is actually being positioned as a strategic mineral now by the Congolese government. So this actually happened like last month, I think. The government increased royalty and the taxes on cobalt from about 2% to almost a 10% increase. And cobalt is actually being positioned to be considered a conflict mineral in its own right. The reason we focus specifically on cobalt, I mean, this is not the only conflict mineral that goes into making lithium-ion batteries. We have coltan and tantalum, like a host of other minerals. And like I mentioned earlier, like cobalt is a byproduct of copper, which is one of like the main conflict minerals. So this industry is actually quite convoluted. And we chose cobalt specifically because of its rising importance. But not to like diminish the importance of any other conflict minerals. We just want to focus on this particular one because of its ubiquity in terms of like electric vehicles, which are quite a new phenomenon.
Right. I'm just wondering if there's anything we learned from the conflict minerals approach that would help Apple. So I know Intel got a lot of credit for creating the first processor that was conflict-free, sourced from Congo. Right? They didn't change their sourcing model as how they did it, and I'm just wondering if our company could look at what worked there, and can we make this actually a good story?
There are some ideas about blockchain, about using blockchain kind of tracking to figure out like which conflict minerals, because often the conflict minerals get mixed up with conflict-free minerals. So kind of like looking at that data and figuring out where exactly this, human rights violations are occurring in the supply chain. So that could definitely be a viable option for Apple at this moment, using blockchain to kind of track the conflict minerals.
And I'm also surprised you guys didn't recommend that we do invest in social programs in Congo for education and for kids. Is that something you guys considered, and what do you think the benefits would be from our company making some large investments with development agencies in Congo?
It is actually something we considered, and we found out that there's an organization called PACT that Microsoft actually partnered with to try and build the local communities. So like educate them, help them to find other sources of income. And so it was actually one of our recommendations. We just ran out of time in fleshing it out, but we would definitely recommend working with local nonprofit organizations to be able to help the community to grow. Even if Apple decides to pull out, we don't want to leave the community, just in despair. We'd like to develop them and help them compete on an international level, even in the future. Yeah.
Well, this is the part where we offer some feedback. I think you all did an outstanding job on your presentation, so much so that you had me to go back and say, now, wait a minute, which one is a philosophy major and which one is international? And it was hard to tell in the presentation because you all seem so very well versed in the whole topic. I have to admit that I was getting educated here with this whole, I knew about the blood diamonds and all, but I didn't quite have the understanding about the cobalt. So I got an education here today, and I think you'll do a very good job of that. presentation. It's very good. One comment I would have was the flow chart where you showed the, that one, back one more. That was a little busy, and I think it's just like loaded with information. I don't know if there's any way that you can condense that to maybe show just more of what is happening from the
Just for
mining
Apple.
to Apple.
Just
Yes.
for Apple, maybe
Yes.
take out the
That'd be
other.
good, because I start looking at industrial mines and, oh heck, I'm lost, you know?
But that's how hard it is for multinationals, honestly, to figure out like, what is actually going on in supply chain. So,
Recommendation for going forward in shorter presentations,
Yeah.
flash, this is what's happening in the multinational world, this is just the Apple. So,
yeah.
don't leave that up there for any length of time, because
Yeah.
I'm lost. I mean, it's like I'm on I-70 and I'm like, oh heck, here's roads going all these different ways, you know, so. But the rest I thought was very good.
Thank you.
I thought it was excellent. I really was really pleased the way you had a little technical glitch. I think, Sarah, you were talking and Cindy and Tracy were trying to fix the slides, but you didn't miss a beat. And those things are going to happen. You know, they're going to happen. It's not if, it's when they happen. So you guys did a great job of just keep on keeping on. Sarah didn't let it bother you. Just get right into your presentation. And I thought that would have rattled a lot of folks. You know, just would have. And the only other recommendation I would make is that you're talking to the board and you're very professional. But the board is the board. We're not Apple employees per se. So I would have maybe thought about saying this is a huge problem, and you know, the fix is going to be immense. And what we're asking you today, Apple, is to take a single step. We're going to make you aware of the problem, but let's take a single step. Let's move in the right direction. It's not going to happen overnight. And there are other models. Tracy, I think you mentioned Nike, the coffee trade, the fair growing coffee, in Bangladesh, the garment workers. I mean, these things have happened before. Maybe not to the degree that you ladies have described, but if I were a board member and I'm leaving the meeting saying, you know what, I can't fix this tomorrow. It's a huge problem, but here's a single step we can make. But I thought it was excellent.
Yeah, great job, you guys. You were all just seemed very comfortable talking. I felt there was a lot of confidence. So there was a relaxed, nice conversational tone, which was good. It wasn't, you guys knew your stuff, but it didn't seem rehearsed. The only thing, when you started out, I felt you were all clustered by the podium, and I wanted you to take up space. So I'm so glad you asked to come over here. I'm like, you know, I would suggest, you know, stand two of you on one side of the screen and one on the other. And take up the space, because you were kind of huddled together, and it just will show, I think you already have the confidence, it will come out more if you guys step out. So Tracy, when you walked over, I really loved it, and that just it was a strong presentation and helped me focus. And then I wasn't worried about the laptop and what was happening over there too. So I definitely recommend you guys take up space when you're speaking. You took on a really complicated issue. It's probably not fair that I'm judging this issue. I worked with the 10K from the Ruby mine before it was sold to the Chinese. I can talk to you afterwards about some of my experiences there, but it's a really tough issue. I think one thing, when you're talking to Apple, what I was looking at, and I wasn't convinced, like on the legal side, what's going to motivate Apple